I can still remember the tenderness of my little brother's skin as I bit down on his arm during a fight we had when I was 12. The softness of his flesh against my teeth and the metallic taste of his blood on my tongue were euphoric, and it was that moment that changed my life forever. The psychologists call it Wendigo psychosis, but the actual term was pathological cannibalism. I can never forget the horrid look on my mother's face as Brenda, my childhood psychologist, told her that I was going to struggle with pathological cannibalism, an extremely rare but real issue that sometimes occurs due to underlying psychiatric disorders or problems. Even though I was so young, I could tell everyone around me thought I was a monster. What made things even worse was that none of the many psychologists my mother dragged me to knew how to handle my issue, because cases involving pathological cannibalistic impulses were extraordinarily rare, and there was little to no knowledge about my condition. My mother often told me that I wasn't always like this, but she could see the signs, as my strange behavior all started when I was 7. During that age, I started showing signs of extreme alatriophagy, a disorder where a person repeatedly eats or consumes things that aren't normally considered food. I would consume everything from my hair to my fingernails, and I would struggle with my mother when she quickly took these things out of my mouth before I could swallow. I would even throw tantrums whenever she tried to stop me. Things only got worse from there, as when I was 10, I developed another condition called dermatophagia, a condition where a person compulsively bites their own skin, drawing blood. I would leave deep marks on my arms, hands, and fingers, and there were cases where my mother had to rush me to the hospital to stop the bleeding. After an examination, the psychologist told my parents that I'd developed a disturbing body-focused repetitive behavior. They made several attempts to fix my peculiar case of BFRB with self-biting behavior, as they tried everything they could to stop me from doing it. In the end, all of their efforts failed, and it wasn't long before my disorders eventually turned into full-blown autophagia, which is the morbid act of consuming one's own flesh. The new condition was basically an extreme form of dermatophagia, as rather than simply biting down on my skin to draw blood, I began to tear out and eat my own flesh. A little while after I turned 12, my mother found me bleeding on the floor with a huge patch of flesh missing from my leg. I had disassociated due to my psychiatric illness and cut off parts of my own skin using a sharp knife. I can still remember the disgust on my mother's face as she found me sitting there with a mouthful of my own flesh. Later that same month, my older brother Kevin tried to stop me from hurting myself again so I wouldn't eat my flesh or bite myself, and I didn't let him. So we got into a huge fight and I bit him. It was at that moment that I got a sick epiphany, as I realized that it would be much better to eat other people to satiate this never-ending hunger for flesh. It was a sick revelation, but even at that young age, I knew that it was much better than eating my own flesh. It was at this point that my childhood psychologist, Brenda, diagnosed me with pathological cannibalism that I talked about earlier. She told my parents that all the disorders I developed throughout my early childhood were leading up to this, and she assured my parents that she'd help me overcome the pathology, which she often referred to as Wendigo psychosis. But even after hours of examinations and therapy sessions, she or any of the following psychologists weren't able to help me. It's hard to put the feelings into words, but I've always felt like there was something sinister living inside of me. A monster that was always whispering in my ear and urging me to sink my teeth into my own flesh just so I could taste my skin and the metallic flavor of the blood that flowed. I always tried my best to fight back, but these feelings were overwhelming, even when I was a child. However, after I viciously bit my brother's arm, the voice changed the words it used to whisper, as it was now telling me to eat and consume everyone around me. I often suffered identity shifts and memory gaps, during which I would commit even more atrocious cannibalistic acts. When I was much older, my psychologist told me that the core motor cluster of psychiatric disorders I'd been suffering from due to my neurological abnormalities had gotten a lot worse with age. They said my cannibalistic urges had become paraphilic, which could unfortunately lead to even more frequent psychosis-driven behavioral escalation, and they urged me to take some medication to subdue my severe paraphilic disorders. I was given several high-dose antipsychotics like olanzapine, risperidone, and haloperidol to treat the underlying psychosis. I was then told that these drugs would help fix and subdue most of the paraphilic disorders and psychiatric illnesses. But no matter how many pills I took, my compulsive urges never fully went away. I secretly lived with these urges, carrying them around like they were a badge of shame. I eventually fell into a deep depression and reached a new low point in my life. But it was around this time that my mother had a long, deep talk with me about my issues, and she told me that I was stronger than my disorders, so I shouldn't let the urges control my life. From that moment on, I made a conscious decision to change my life. I went to college for 4 years and got a good paying job. I even started dating, and I eventually married my beautiful wife, Claire, who gave birth to a son we named Philip. It took me several years of struggle to get my life to that point, and even though I felt like I'd achieved what I set out to do, the voice of that monster was still there. I eventually stopped taking my antipsychotics out of anger because I assumed they weren't working anymore, as I could occasionally hear the voice telling me to rip apart the flesh of my wife, Claire, while she was asleep. I felt like I didn't need them anymore, as I told myself that the love for my family would help me overcome my urges. But I was wrong, as the voices just got louder. I knew it was only a matter of time before my disorders got out of hand again, and I didn't want to dissociate and hurt my family, as I knew I would never forgive myself. So I desperately looked for an outlet, and it wasn't long before I came across the infamous Cannibals Cafe forum on the dark web. I heard about it before, but I didn't think it was real. I'd also seen some people online saying that the original site, which used to be on the internet during the late 90s, had been taken down, so I thought there was no other way to access it. However, one night when the voices had become unbearable as they were constantly urging me to carry out sadistic acts, I downloaded the Tor browser to access the dark web, and I eventually came across a dark web forum called Cannibals Cafe. I was confused, as I knew the original Cannibal Cafe website on the ClearNet had been shut down around 2002. However, I later found out from members of the exclusive forum that even though both forums shared the same name, this particular dark web forum was inspired by and modeled after the original Cannibal Cafe. This dark web forum felt like my salvation, as it allowed me to talk about things my psychologist didn't understand with other like-minded cannibals on the forum. I logged on and talked to other members of the forum every night after my wife had gone to bed. There was a small part of me that knew what I was doing was wrong, but every minute I spent on that forum made me feel like I had finally found a place where I belonged. It really seemed like I was a recovering alcoholic who had just walked into a wine tasting event. But in this case, the alcoholism was cannibalism, and the wine tasters were connoisseurs of human flesh who constantly validated my desires by telling me I wasn't wrong for feeling this way. All of the anonymous people on the Cannibals Cafe forum became an avenue for me to vent and channel my urges. The voices grew much louder now, but I was fine with it because I came across an anonymous individual whose username was Maywest Disciple 783, and he told me that I should embrace the monster I believed was inside of me. I met Maywest Disciple 783 about a month after I started visiting the Cannibals Cafe forum, and we grew very close. We were both huge fans of the Rotenberg cannibal, a German man named Armin Maywest who consumed parts of another man named Bernd Brandes. Maywest was a cannibal like us, and in the year 2001, he posted an ad on the internet looking for a willing participant who would allow him to consume their body and fulfill his cannibalistic desires. Bernd Brandes saw the ad and agreed to do it. After meeting Maywest, both men severed Bernd's genitalia and ate it. Unfortunately, Bernd later died, but Armin Maywest did not let his corpse go to waste, as he consumed parts of the body before he was unjustly thrown in prison. Maywest Disciple 783 and I had a lengthy conversation about how unjust the incarceration of Armin Maywest was, and we even spoke about pooling some money together so we could buy the alleged tape of Maywest eating Bernd's corpse that's somewhere out there on the dark web. After we bonded over our shared love for Armin Maywest, I began to text Maywest Disciple 783 for hours on end. We eventually made our own private dark web forum called Cannibals Anonymous, where we would talk about our desires, and he told me that I shouldn't try to silence the voice in my head with the high-dose antipsychotics that psychologists had told me to start taking again. He told me to accept the words the little voice in my head kept whispering, because there was nothing wrong with eating one another if it was consensual. The more we talked, the more I believed that the anonymous man behind Mae West Disciple 783 was the only person in the world who truly understood me. We spent most of our free time texting back and forth during the months that followed, and one Saturday, Mae West Disciple 783 sent me a message that would once again alter the course of my life moving forward. He suggested that we both fulfill our desires like Mae West and Brandis, and that we should set a date and a location where we could consensually eat parts of each other's flesh. I was ecstatic because I'd never had a willing individual offer me parts of their flesh to consume, and I remember telling myself that there was nothing wrong with it, as it was all consensual. After texting back and forth on our private dark web forum for some time, I quickly took out a huge chunk of my wife's and my savings to buy a remote cabin we could use to carry out our plans. I even lied to my wife, telling her that I had a business trip that weekend and I was counting the days until it happened. However, when the weekend came, I got an unfortunate text from Mae West Disciple 783, telling me that he had second thoughts and that he wanted to back out. Words can't explain the rage I felt at that moment, and I became even more infuriated when I tried to convince him, and he stopped answering my texts. I'd stopped going to my psychologist at this point, and I'd thrown away all the antipsychotics I'd been taking, so my mind couldn't handle the rejection. I remember letting out a guttural scream, and suddenly everything around me went dark. When I came back to my senses, I watched in horror as my wife Claire was cowering in front of me while holding our 2-year-old son Philip, who now had bleeding wounds all over his body and was screaming at the top of his lungs. I didn't need anyone to tell me the atrocities I'd just committed, as I could see nasty bite marks all over my son's body, and I could still taste the metallic flavor of his blood on my tongue. I couldn't believe I tried to eat and consume my very own son, and I collapsed screaming because I remembered that horrified look on people's faces when I used to dissociate as a kid. No one had looked at me that way since my mother found me eating my flesh when I was 12, but it was the same expression my wife had on her face as she put enough distance between our son and me. I will never be able to express the magnitude of guilt I felt in the hours that followed. My wife Claire, who was still looking at me like I was a monster, had to fight me off and stop me from eating our own son. I knew that was the end of our family, but Claire loved me too much to call the police, and even if she hated me in that moment, she still knew I was the man who loved her for all those years, and she didn't want her son's father to spend the rest of his life in prison. So she decided to check me into a mental institution, saying I was a danger to myself and others. I didn't protest, as I knew I deserved much worse for what I'd done. It's been about 3 years now in this institution. My wife has stopped coming to see me, and I don't even blame her. I don't even know what day it is, but I am currently sitting in my room writing this disturbing table of what was once my life in a journal to pass the time. I often wonder if death would finally satiate the seemingly insatiable morbid hunger of the monster that still lives inside of me. It's taken me some time, but I've come to the realization that it's only when I leave this world that the voice nagging me in my head will stop. And I truly hope that when that day comes, I will finally understand what it means to have some peace and quiet. In the year 2004, a truly morbid true crime case that is mostly unknown to the public occurred in the small town of Fergus Falls, Minnesota. It was an extremely niche case, and most of the details were redacted. But according to a few statements from locals, it was later revealed that an anonymous man was institutionalized at the Fergus Falls Regional Treatment Center after he had attempted to attack his family. Official reports were sparse, as the case was never reported to local authorities. However, a few anonymous neighbors who gave second-hand accounts claimed that the institutionalized man had attempted to cannibalize and eat his own infant son the night before. His wife, whose name was also redacted, chose to give no official statements. Locals believed that she wanted to protect her husband, whose attempted filicide would have landed him at least 20 years in prison on an attempted murder charge, so she denied everything. The widely unknown case was seen as a rumor during the weeks that followed the initial reports, but records show that the disturbing details of the case actually happened, as the anonymous man apparently suffered from a psychotic and dissociative episode, which led his wife to admit him to the Fergus Falls Regional Treatment Center. While it was never confirmed, sources close to the unnamed family said that even though he'd committed an atrocious act that nearly killed their son, she still didn't want the father of her child to spend the rest of his life in prison. It is unclear what happened after the anonymous man was checked into the Fergus Falls Regional Treatment Center. Several records show that the center was closed in 2007, and both his and his family's current whereabouts are unknown. I also found it difficult to trace the exclusive dark web Cannibal Cafe forum that the Anam referenced in 2004. Several records confirm that the original Cannibal Cafe never existed on the dark web, as it was strictly a ClearNet website created in 1994 by an individual using the alias Pero Loco. While I was able to confirm the exact origins of the dark web forum mentioned in this case, it is believed to have been one of the several successor sites that emerged after the original Cannibal Cafe was shut down in 2002. The gruesome case of attempted cannibalism sparked similar discourse to the more famous Armin Mae West case during the months that followed the incident. There were apparently a few people who argued whether an individual should be jailed or placed in an asylum for carrying out a consensual act, even if the act was something as morbid as cannibalism. However, regardless of differing opinions, the law remains crystal clear. Several law enforcement agents who weighed in with their opinions on the case stated that it doesn't matter whether both parties consent to ghoulish acts like cannibalism or murder, because at the end of the day, these acts are illegal, and any individual carrying them out will be punished by the full force of the law.
Dread. On the 17th of October 2019, I met an anonymous man on the infamous dark web forum, Dread. For those who don't know the platform, Dread is often referred to as Reddit's evil twin, a place where dark web users can talk freely. The Anon's username was White Noise, and my life was never the same after I came into contact with this individual. While I didn't know it at the time, visiting the dark side of the internet to acquire the services of White Noise led me to lose everything I'd ever loved. There hasn't been a day that has passed where I don't regret my actions, and I know I'll carry this guilt for the rest of my life. It all began after my 42nd birthday. I'd been going through a midlife crisis for a few months, and I was in a really bad place. I'd recently lost my job after my company abruptly decided to cut costs by letting people go. My marriage was also on the rocks. I was constantly fighting with my wife Laura, and my son Simon had stopped speaking to me altogether. I knew he blamed me for the problems I was having with his mother, which only made things worse between us. It truly felt like I'd hit rock bottom. I was desperate to take the edge off, searching for something, anything, that could make me feel alive again. It wasn't long before my mind wandered back to old, bad habits, and I began to seriously entertain the idea of using hard substances again. I knew it was a bad decision. I was an unemployed man in his 40s, isolated from his family, and clearly unraveling. My better judgment screamed at me not to do it, but at the time, using substances again felt like the only thing that might pull me out of the slump I was in. I'd been down that road before, back when I was in college. During finals, I'd experimented with cocaine after convincing myself it would help me push through when coffee and prescription stimulants like Adderall no longer felt strong enough. I handled things relatively well back then, telling myself it was only temporary, which is why I stopped using it immediately after I graduated. This time was different. I wasn't a stressed-out student looking for a quick boost. I was a miserable man who had been falling into a deep hole ever since I turned 40, and I'd convinced myself that going back to old habits might give me the relief I was so desperately looking for. As the nights dragged on, I found myself spending hours online, and it wasn't long before my desperation led me to the darker side of the internet. This was when I first came across Dread. I'd heard of the platform before, often described as the Darknet's front page or Reddit's dark twin on tour. I initially planned to silently observe, limiting myself to reading through anonymous posts. But after a couple of hours, I worked up the courage to post something of my own. I made sure to keep it vague, careful not to say too much. Even so, I knew that anyone paying attention would understand what I was really asking for and point me in the right direction. A few days passed and nothing happened. However, right when I was about to give up, I received a private DM from an Anon with the username White Noise. His message was short and vague, just like my post, and it read, "Read your post, and it sounds like you need a helping hand on your journey. I could offer that hand the next time I choose to exist, if you still want to be enlightened." White Noise never explicitly stated what it was that he did or how he would offer a helping hand, as he intentionally kept the language vague for deniability. However, I was able to read between the lines, and I understood perfectly what was being implied. So I responded with, "I'll take the hand, if it points me in the right direction on my journey to enlightenment." This was how my relationship with White Noise began. I had to jump through several hoops and even more cryptic messages to prove I wasn't an undercover cop, but I was finally able to acquire the services White Noise provided after all his initial doubts had been cleared. One of the first things White Noise made clear was that, even though we'd met on Dread, the platform was simply a discussion forum, not a marketplace. Again, he never explicitly stated this, but he made sure we never did any business on the platform itself, only using it to vaguely communicate. I could also tell the Anon behind White Noise was a professional due to his insane digital OPSEC. White Noise was obsessed with keeping his operational security at the highest level, constantly taking several steps that made it seem like he never existed, in addition to keeping all his operations untraceable. One of these many steps was the use of different usernames and accounts whenever we communicated on Dread. While I initially met him as White Noise, his username constantly changed with every new message, as I would often receive messages from other accounts with different usernames like Null or Static. It was hard to keep up with this, as I often couldn't tell which of these accounts was actually him. So I asked if he could give me a code name I could use if I was ever in doubt. While White Noise was completely against the use of a common code name, as he liked to avoid patterns, he understood my concerns. So he told me that if I was ever unsure, or if I couldn't tell which of the many Dread accounts was truly him, I should use the names of any notable figures from the Roman Empire, like Caesar, Augustus, or Nero, and he would respond with Salve or Ave. Keeping up with hundreds of aliases was just the tip of the iceberg, as White Noise always used burner sites or single-use landing pages for all our transactions. The technical term used to describe these burner onion websites is ephemeral hidden services, and they are basically short-lived onion sites that exist briefly for communication or for a single transaction before they are taken offline forever. I'd initially thought White Noise would have a website similar to the infamous Silk Road, Hansa, Alphabay, or Dream Market, where I could choose the substances I wanted. However, he told me that major sites draw too much attention, so he would send me a burner site where I would quickly write out the drugs I wanted. After he'd seen my request, the site was then discarded immediately. White Noise also asked for all the payments to be made in his preferred cryptocurrency, Monero. When I asked why he didn't just use Bitcoin, White Noise told me that Monero was a privacy-focused cryptocurrency that was virtually untraceable if no mistakes were made during the transfer. Once the payments were made, I would be sent a time and a random location where my package would be dropped. The operation was essentially ironclad, leaving no room for errors, and while the process could sometimes get complicated, it still saved me the hassle of dealing with shady street dealers at my age. I can still remember telling myself to only use a little bit every time I picked up a package. I would often save the drugs for the hardest days and use them to give myself a little boost while I searched for a new job. However, it wasn't long before I began using more than I was supposed to, as I found myself using after every fight with Laura and my son, Simon. This period of my life was a blur, and the only time I truly felt anything was when I was using or talking to White Noise on Dread about the next order. I even started to look forward to going out and picking up the packages, as it allowed me to leave the house. I know this is going to sound crazy, but I found more comfort in my short conversations with a faceless Anon on the dark web than with my own family, and at some point, I even started thinking that White Noise was my only friend. I spent most of my days on dread waiting to see his next cryptic message. It began to feel like a real-life game, and the drugs were my reward. The fights with my wife became even more frequent during this period, and I began using every single day. I eventually started placing more orders than I could afford with white noise, and I eventually racked up a large debt. I'd been secretly using the family's savings to buy the drugs, and I'd basically spent all of it, which led me to ask for delayed payments. White Noise was initially fine with sending me packages on credit due to the frequency of my orders, but over time he got fed up with my delays and stopped sending new packages until I cleared my debt. I'd already gotten hooked on the drugs at this point, and I exchanged some heated messages with White Noise as I couldn't handle his constant refusal to send me any more packages on credit. I began selling off some things, like my wife's jewelry and a few other valuables in the house, to pay him back, but I knew that wouldn't cover half the amount of my outstanding debt. So I began avoiding his constant messages asking for the large sums of money I owed him, and I began looking for other sellers on Dread that offered the same services, using the money I got from selling a few valuables from the house to get my fix. I really thought it would all blow over and White Noise would forget about the debt in due time. However, it wasn't long before he came to collect what he was owed. It all began one Saturday morning when our German Shepherd Jake went missing. My son Simon told me he wasn't in the kennel out back where he'd left him, so we all went to look for him, as we assumed he was somewhere in the neighborhood. However, after hours of searching, we weren't able to find Jake, and after coming back home, my wife told me that there was a package for me at the door with a note. I hadn't ordered anything, so I was confused as to what could be in the large brown box. However, when I opened the note, my heart dropped to my stomach as the message read, "Give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar." Words can't explain the terror I felt as I wondered how he'd gotten my address to send the package. I'd always been so careful whenever I picked up the packages, making sure I was never followed. But I guess he might have followed me back home when I initially started asking for drugs on credit. I let out a muffled scream after I slowly opened the box to see a severed bloody paw, and I knew without a doubt that it belonged to our German Shepherd, Jake. I didn't let my son see it, as I didn't want him to be traumatized. I also hid the box from my wife, as I wouldn't know where to begin to explain its contents. I cried myself to sleep that night, as I wondered what White Noise had done to Jake. I remember telling myself that it couldn't get any worse than this. But unfortunately for me, things took a much more sinister turn during the following weeks. I was still reeling from the first package when White Noise sent the second box. It appeared on my doorstep roughly 2 weeks after the first box had arrived. I quickly took the new package to my room before my family could see it, and when I opened it, I let out a guttural scream. Lying in the box was what appeared to be a human heart. I found it hard to breathe as the sight terrified me, but upon closer inspection, I realized that it was actually a pig's heart, and the note that was placed on top of the package read, "In the box lies the heart of the traitor Brutus, who stabbed Caesar in the back. But just like Brutus, all traitors end up falling on their own sword in the end." The cryptic Roman-inspired note was written in red ink, and I could tell they were all referencing the codename Caesar, which was often used by White Noise in our earlier messages. I waited until everyone had gone to bed before burning the box with the pig heart. However, the next package soon arrived, and it was the worst of the three. I'd been wondering what White Noise would send next, and I imagined it would be another morbid animal organ or a gruesome severed limb. However, what arrived was an unmarked envelope with no note. After I opened it up, I saw recent images of Laura and Simon, showing Laura picking up Simon after school. As I said earlier, there was no cryptic Roman-inspired note this time, as the close-up photos alone sent a clear message of what would come next if I didn't pay my debt. I knew I couldn't go to the police with this, as I'd already implicated myself by buying illegal substances on the dark web. I also didn't have enough money to hire a private investigator who could help me track down White Noise without any involvement from the authorities. I was running out of options, and I knew it was only a matter of time before White Noise carried out his threats against Laura and Simon. Even though I'd been on bad terms with my wife and son for the past few months, they were the only things I had left in this world, and I knew I wouldn't be able to live with myself if I was responsible for their deaths. So I made up my mind to go to the authorities. After having one last family dinner, I got in my car that evening and drove to the police station. I knew I would get charged for my involvement in illegal activities on Dread and on the dark web, but I knew it was the only way to keep my family safe. The detectives at the station carefully listened to my confession as I told them everything from the beginning. Once they'd finished taking down all my statements, they immediately put my family and me under surveillance. They began to track down White Noise. The detectives had planned on finding White Noise before he could harm Laura or Simon. However, all their efforts to track him down failed in the end. The detectives explained how difficult it was tracking White Noise online, as the Anon avoided leaving any metadata by using separate air-gapped devices for keys. He'd also avoided patterns in our payments due to his use of burner onions and disposable dead drops. As the investigation continued, the authorities attempted a different approach as they tried to trace the money I'd sent to White Noise for the packages, but that also proved impossible, as Monero transactions can't be traced on the blockchain itself. This was why White Noise made sure all the payments were made using this particular cryptocurrency, and he avoided any operational mistakes that the authorities could potentially use to link him to these payments. The detectives then tried analyzing the envelope with Laura and Simon's photos for any fingerprints White Noise may have left, but they couldn't find anything. The detectives even analyzed the messages White Noise had sent on Dread to see if he'd used any slang that could link him to a particular region, but this line of investigation also led to a dead end. I had no other options now but to pay White Noise the money I owed. Even though the detectives warned against this, as they told me doing so would technically constitute obstruction and that I could be charged, I couldn't risk retaliation from White Noise when he found out I went to the authorities. So I secretly took out another mortgage on the house and sent the funds I owed to finally put an end to all of the morbid packages and threats. I never heard from White Noise again after that. The detectives were furious that I'd gone behind their backs to pay White Noise, but they chose not to pursue any obstruction charges at that point in the investigation, as they knew I was under a lot of duress ever since the lives of my son and wife were placed on the line. The authorities still continued their search, even after I'd paid, and they planned to trace my last payment to the Anon's location, hoping to get a silver lining for my mistake. However, no matter how hard they tried, the individual behind White Noise was never found. After the investigation failed to identify White Noise, the authorities turned their attention to me. Even though I'd come forward and cooperated with tracking down White Noise, I'd also broken several laws before the threats. I was charged with possession of controlled substances, use of electronic communications to facilitate drug crimes, and conspiracy to purchase illegal drugs. To make matters worse, the prosecutors also charged me with intent to distribute, as they argued that the large quantities of illegal substances I acquired from White Noise exceeded personal use. They came to this conclusion based on the volume and frequency of the packages I received, and they believed I should be investigated further. However, I had no prior record, and due to my cooperation, I was able to avoid trafficking charges. My defense, in addition to the detectives who handled my case, argued that most of the focus should be on unmasking White Noise. Due to my lack of prior violent record, in addition to the evidence of coercion and threats, I was able to get off with a suspended sentence. While I had narrowly avoided prison time, I was given mandatory drug rehabilitation and probation supervision. I was also ordered to have no contact with any dark web platforms for the duration of my probation. I'd managed to survive my charges in court, but I couldn't survive the battle that waited for me at home, as Laura asked for a divorce. I didn't blame her, as I already knew my marriage wouldn't survive the truth. I'd placed them in grave danger, and the betrayal of stealing from our savings and selling her jewelry and valuables, was the final nail in the coffin. All this pretty much destroyed the life I thought I was holding together. And even though I'd done it to save their lives, Laura was still furious that I'd gone against the detective's advice by taking out another mortgage to pay White Noise. It was a long, bitter battle in court, but once it was over, Laura took our son Simon, in addition to everything I had left, and I didn't even fight her, as I knew I deserved nothing for what I did. Things got a lot worse for me after Laura had taken everything, as the divorce proceedings and the mounting legal fees left me with significant debt that I wasn't able to pay. In the end, I'd lost my family, the house, my car, and I was left with nothing but the consequences of my actions. There isn't a day that goes by where I don't regret logging onto the dark web and making that post on Dread. I know I'm majorly responsible for everything that happened, but I will forever curse the day that I met the faceless Anon who is probably still out there roaming the forums of Dread under the username White Noise. On the 23rd of May, 2019, one of the largest dark web drug cases involving the U.S. Department of Justice, Germany's Federal Criminal Police, BKA, Europol, the Dutch National Police, Eurojust, the FBI, and the DEA led to the closure of a major dark web marketplace. The operation brought an end to the infamous Wall Street Market, WSM, an important dark web marketplace that functioned as a central distribution point for cocaine, cannabis, heroin, amphetamines, in addition to several other forms of contraband. The case was part of a nearly 2-year international investigation, and while it led to the arrest of the marketplace's administrators, who were identified as Thibault Lucie, Klaus Martin Frost, Jonathan Kalla, and Marcos Paulo, the authorities believed that a few major players were able to escape and continue operations on other parts of the dark web. The authorities followed several new investigative threads after the fall of Wall Street Market, leading to another operation in 2020 called Operation Disruptor, which resulted in 179 arrests. Roughly 500 kilograms of drugs ranging from heroin, fentanyl, and methamphetamines were seized, in addition to millions of dollars in virtual currency and cash. However, several dark web vendor accounts once again eluded the authorities, and one of those vendors is believed to be the anonymous individual who is now operating under the username White Noise on the dark web platform, Dread. The details of the story you just heard were based on a real, true crime case, as several reports state that a few major players on Wall Street Market before its collapse in 2019 had extensive ties to the forum Dread. Authorities were able to uncover evidence that proves the leakage of back-end credentials and server information on Dread to temporarily destabilize the market during their investigation. And while nothing has been confirmed, the Anon behind White Noise is said to be deeply involved in these operations. The real name of the individual in the story who came into contact with White Noise on Dread has been redacted in the case files. The names used in the story for his family were also aliases to keep their identities safe, so finding any additional information on their current whereabouts proved difficult. Further investigation showed that the dark web vendor operating under the username White Noise was linked to markets such as White House Market, Wall Street Market, Empire, Nightmare, and several other dark web marketplaces. The elusive White Noise had apparently avoided being caught during the fall of Wall Street Market and Operation Disruptor by migrating to new markets, re-establishing vendor accounts, and strategically resetting his infrastructure. In 2019, federal prosecutors brought several indictments against other dark web distributors. However, despite their best efforts, the Anon behind White Noise continues to evade the authorities, carrying out his seemingly untraceable activities on the dark web.